So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Sarah, Stacy, Deb, Chelsea, David, and Elizabeth for sharing that insight, that experience. What you've just heard highlights both where we were at the end of 2019 and just a glimpse of what we've been able to do over the last 9 months. Every piece of that work, in my view, is a reason, frankly, to be optimistic at a time when optimism and hope can be a little bit hard to come by. So if the call gets cut off right now, I hope you take that with you. What I'm about to do is pretty low on the list of Zoom best practices. Nobody wants to watch a talking head for another 15 or 20, but those of you on this call are a unique group, narrower than our normal approach to the annual meeting, and folks who are both new to our governance and many who've been engaged for a long period of time. And I think it's important to share what we've done, but also how we think about our role and what we see going on in the months and years ahead. So I hope you'll bear with me. When it comes to building on what you just heard, it was a little bit hard to know where to start, but to me, in this case, it makes sense to start close to home. I want to extend a keynote of gratitude to our staff. Right now, they're zoomed in from their homes, just as they have been since March 13th. We pivoted on Friday, March 13th, onto remote footing and launched a fast-paced, coordinated response to the pandemic. That response included an audacious goal, a commitment to partnership, and a keen sense of purpose. The volume of that work has been astounding, and this team has not missed a beat. In my view, the VCF team has honored the unique role of a community foundation and elevated the core faith that neighbors will step up for each other in a crisis. These moments are the moments for which a community foundation exists. Our work in the last few months has also deepened our credibility and built confidence among funders and partners. That credibility is the product of good teams and great people, and in particular, their emotional investment, the care, diligence, and attention they provide to those partners. It's also the product of our approach to impact and of our stewardship. These attributes are manifest every day by the people in this organization at every level. As members of the organization and as leaders in your community and in our governance, you should know that about this team and this organization. I hope you take it with you and you share it among those in your circles, that there's an incredible team here and an organization that continues to believe that it's possible and important to make progress and to make a difference. Their work, the work of this team, is one of the things that inspires me and gives me hope, and I hope it does for you too. Looking back, starting in 2018, we took an ambitious step, focusing nearly all of our discretionary resources on this idea of closing the opportunity gap. We took it because of the systemic social and economic schism we saw emerging and its presence at the root of so many community and civic challenges. We weren't alone in that concern. Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation in 2016. Have we heard and heeded the frustrations of communities anxious and unsettled as their economic security erodes? Have we been too focused on familiar ground, overlooking wider circumstances of suffering and inequality? Robert Putnam, our guest speaker at the 2015 annual meeting. We might ponder whether the bleak, socially estranged future facing poor kids in America today could have unanticipated political consequences tomorrow. That was written well before 2016. As a country, we now have unique visibility into national trends and truths based on the work of big data and economists like Raj Chetty. It is possible to predict economic mobility down to the neighborhood and the zip code, to predict the proposition of a place. That insight tells us that anyone born since 1980 has a 50-50 shot of doing better than their parents. If you were born in the 1940s, that was 90%. That's a meaningfully different generational perspective on the proposition offered by our society. And that's before you control for race and ethnicity. Those numbers are even more stark if you're born into a Black, brown, or indigenous family. We operate in a civic framework, a set of agreements and promises that we make to each other. Its design is predicated on the idea that we recognize and see a shared stake and we take responsibility for each other's experience. We know that history and privilege have obscured the truth of that framework, In our current moment, we have to ask, what stake can we expect people to take in each other's future when data and experience tells us their prospects are in decline? When less than half of kids will do better than their parents, and less than half of kids and parents have a stake worth giving something up. And this was all in play, simmering, before 30 million people across the country became suddenly unemployed, and tens of thousands of Vermonters lost their jobs, and the pandemic compounded our community challenges. Sarah's slides on 2019 described an important year for exploring the opportunity gap across the Vermont context, listening in communities and engaging that framework. A little over $17 million in aligned grant making, close work with cornerstone partners and high levels of coordination with Let's Grow Kids, High Meadows, the Curtis Fund, and the J. Warren and Lois McClure Foundation, and across our Vermont Mission Investing platform. That progress is the kind of thing that gives me hope about where we can go. It also reflects two key transitions: the evolution of the Vermont Community Foundation and our supporting organizations from grant makers to long-term problem solvers. It also reflects our increasing ability to transition our unique insight, what we learn about Vermont issues and Vermont communities, into what we do and what we offer as advice and guidance to Vermont philanthropists. All of that good work was underway, and then 2020. The frailty of these systems in this moment, the sense of scarcity and vulnerability, the lack of resilience, the structural inequity reflected in the opportunity gap is the kindling to which the pandemic put a match. As with folks on the ground across the social sector, without whom the experience of Vermonters in the last 7 months would have been far, far worse, we find ourselves operating at the confluence of 4 community crises, with a 5th inexorably present. The first is the public health crisis of the pandemic and its related urgent needs. The second is the economic dislocation triggered by the pandemic and the incongruous experience of those with college degrees and with assets in the markets, and that of low and moderate income families. In Vermont, our small business economy, key to our communities, has been battered. Consumer spending is down 7.3% from January, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Not even close. Who's been pinched? Among high-income families in Vermont, spending is actually 20% above where it was in January 9 months ago. For middle and low-income families, it is down 8% and 34%. On a national level, just as an example, job postings in hospitality and tourism, a key industry sector for the state, are down 40% over where they were in 2019 at this time of year. It's likely that we have yet to glimpse the full economic impact of the pandemic on our communities. The third crisis is born of the lived experience of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this country and in Vermont, elevated by the surge of awareness and activism triggered by events of police brutality, but focusing in an expansive way on this country's edifice of systemic racism. This movement has unmasked an inflamed passion and awareness that for too long was muted by comfort and privilege. With that understanding comes the promise and the commitment that we must share a future in which all Vermonters, for now and in the decades ahead, regardless of race or color, see this place as one filled with potential, hope, equity, and a sense of connection. The fourth crisis, a change in climate reflected in the fires across the Pacific states and the Mountain West, haze from which has begun to color our own sunsets on the Adirondacks across the lake. Last year, as we asked Vermont voices to consider what lay ahead for the state, for our communities, the reality of climate migration was already top of mind for many who shared their thoughts. The scope of these 4 challenges is united and informed by a common 5th, the weakness of the civic framework that should be addressing them. We're bearing witness to the inability of our civic architecture to address big problems and compel failing systems to adapt. A pandemic, a climate crisis, equal treatment, and economic security. The scale of these challenges and the suffering our lack of progress causes require us to come together. Now, we could indulge in a debate around logic models and the relative urgency of each crisis as it unfolds. I hadn't even mentioned yet the opioid epidemic and the fact that overdose deaths in Vermont have already increased by 20% in the first half of the year. But the ability to focus narrowly on one issue instead of looking upstream to where those issues intersect is really only possible if you have trust, stated or implied, that someone else is going to do the work on the others. And who does that work fall to? These are big problems, uncertain times, real suffering, and real frustration. We need to ask ourselves who is looking out beyond. We need to ask ourselves how the work on each gets done and where we fit as an organization, as individuals. Will we approach this work as we have thus far this century, from a zero-sum scarcity mindset that pulls us apart and assumes that when our neighbor or another community gains a step, we lose one? Or will we come together with a sense of shared destiny to lift the conditions that hold these challenges in place? The smart folks at the FSG group describe systems change as the work of shifting the conditions that hold problems in place. Shifting the conditions that hold problems in place. Big problems in uncertain times. Real people, real frustration. What's familiar feels safe and comfortably authentic in uncertain times. It's tempting to do what we've done before and focus on what fits our own pattern of thinking. If we let that alluring comfort guide our work, as Walker put it, we risk turning away from the broad circumstances of suffering and inequality and disruption that is faced in our backyard. These are not someone else's problems to solve. History is being made right now in this moment. A generation from now, one of two stories will be told. That this was the window of time in which people realized too late the stark consequences of our inability to see past patterns of behavior and accept a commonly defined interest and sacrifice for it. Or they'll tell the story of a hopeful time in which leadership came from new quarters and people came together in the spirit of shared fate, in the faith that we can do better and be better if we do the work, that we have the ability to correct failing systems and cause real suffering. A hopeful time in which we came together in the shared space of communities. We came together honestly across history, wealth, race, region, education, ability, gender, with an expectation and a commitment that all aspects of society, government, faith, business, for-profit, non-profit, and philanthropy aligned to do more and share more and listen more and think more, give more and act together in a way that fulfills the promises we've made to each other and the promises we make to the messy entirety of our local, state, and national communities. Race, climate, economic imbalance, pandemic, and civic revival, headway is ours to make. As a community foundation, we always choose to hope and to believe. In that messy alchemy of that web of life and community and the cycles of generations, we believe there's room for progress based on the spirit of giving and passion for place. For individuals, giving is a way of doing something. It's an action at a time when actions are hard to come by. We can talk, we can give, we can serve, we can vote, we can volunteer. We can do the work of caring for our families and our neighbors and those who work alongside us. In this moment, as a vehicle for philanthropy, it's our responsibility to always choose hope, to lean into the belief that a society can correct, not because we're immune to anxiety or cynicism, definitely not, but because we're privileged to witness daily acts of generosity. We're privileged to witness the sheer creativity that exists when people come together. Our view of the world tells us the essential psychology of care remains abundant among our friends and neighbors. But hope alone isn't a strategy. And those of us who are part of this web have unique tools at our disposal, and we can't let them sit idle as we look at the coming years. Jamie Marasotis, who's head of the Lumina Foundation, recently observed that charity alone is not enough. Charity is about help, about meeting urgent needs, he said. Philanthropy is different. Philanthropy is focused not on symptoms, but on root causes. It is systemic, not episodic. It is active rather than reactive. Clear-eyed, what does this mean for the Vermont Community Foundation? Not quite as absolute as Marasotis. That wouldn't be right for a community foundation. But it does mean we have to keep our eyes on the long view. even in the midst of emergencies and harsh experiences stemming from 4 crises. When school-age clerks at supermarkets are taking extra shifts because they're home from school, deemed essential, and their parents are out of work. When the line for food is nearly 2,000 cars long. When leaders of color are packing up their kids and leaving town because they feel so unsafe from the hate that lives next door. Even with these fires burning, our job is to balance our attention to those experiences and the fierce urgency of right now with our work on the root causes and the structures at the heart of the opportunity gap, the heart of inequity, and the heart of systemic failures that drive them. We know how to take the long view. Long after attention went elsewhere, the High Meadows Fund is still advancing key watershed and community resilience strategies informed by the lessons of Hurricane Irene 10 years ago. That kind of attention over time is where progress lies. The long view means spending a decade to build a public consensus around the need for universal access to high quality early childcare in the state, as Let's Grow Kids has done. It means we need to take risks. Philanthropy can take risks that others can't. Risks like a simple promise to pay for a single class at the community college for every Vermont high school graduate in 2020. With 650 registrations in place, we know the value of taking a risk. 30 years in, the McClure family is still teaching us how to give with warm hands. Risk is the state's largest private scholarship grant maker, the Curtis Fund, adapting their strategy from traditional higher education and increasing funding for credentials of value that connect people to a skill and a job. It also means adjusting our work so we're listening and integrating what we hear and learn, building connection across community infrastructure from the unique, albeit imperfect and privileged perspective of a community foundation, across formal and informal networks, public, private, for-profit, nonprofit, civic, social, grassroots, grass tops, high level, state, local, federal. Leadership and engagement must come from each of these in this moment and align to address what's facing our communities. It means asking what it looks like for those communities in all their complexity to have a more active voice in the decisions about where charitable dollars go to work. There's a saying in disaster management that the middle of an emergency is no time to exchange business cards. These are big questions and big challenges that we're committed to wrestling with. And to that end, I'd like to highlight the following high-level priorities in the coming year. These reflect both practical objectives for the organization, but also our aspiration to advance the line in community philanthropy. Adapting to a sustained and decentralized work environment. Enhanced communications, including more frequent events and communications on emerging concepts and community insight. Adapting our grant-making program and community advised programs to more effectively incorporate the voices of our neighbors' lived experience. Adapting our opportunity gap framework to expressly include the lessons of the pandemic and issues of racial equity. And it means committing to assessing the entirety of our engagement with the financial sector as an investor, starting with a net impact review of our investment pools and proposing an increase to the Vermont investment pool allocation with a focus on women and BIPOC-owned enterprises. The opportunity gap, our focus on the systems for early childhood, youth development, support for working families, access to college and career training, and economic vitality. It's all about organizing our thinking into a strategic framework, imperfect but modeled on national and state research. If we start getting some of these systems right, we start making some progress, we believe that people can have confidence that they'll see a tomorrow that looks a whole lot better than today. Equity and the creation of economic and community resilience has always been at the heart of that work. The experience of the pandemic in the past few months has only elevated that urgency and that sense of commitment. We are an ambitious organization, not for its own sake. We are ambitious in the belief that progress can be made. And the act of giving that we get to witness feeds that belief. Our work over the last 6 months and the year prior reflects the increasing maturity of our systems thinking and our problem-solving skills. We know we can be effective in their pursuit. The experiences of our neighbors and what we see across Vermont communities and in the world around us tells us that we must aspire to be at least that. These are hard times, There's a lot of fear out there about what tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year might bring. I believe the Community Foundation, composed of more than 800 different funds and interests, and broadly, but no doubt imperfectly reflective of the values of our state, has a responsibility to show that path forward. We have a responsibility to bring hope and optimism to the work. These plans set the table for doing so. They lay the groundwork for better understanding and transparency around the entirety of our impact, including the impact of our investment pools and managed assets. They position our organization for enhanced community insight and understanding, problem solving, and systems change, shifting the conditions that hold problems in place. That is our aspiration for community philanthropy and for our mission of increasing philanthropy in this state. I want to thank Gay Symington for making the observation that we seem to be getting lots of practice in disruption. And that, I think what I wrote on Friday, the 13th of March still rings true. In Vermont, even as we are asked to keep our distance, we will find a way to come together. We will find a way to come together. I still believe that. Someday we're all going to be together again under a tent, in a barn at the field days, or one of the fairs, one of the fairgrounds. We'll have a chance to have a beer, have a bowl of ice cream as we did in Woodstock. Hopefully we'll be together sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, we may be apart, but we stand together shoulder to shoulder with each other on these big challenges. So I want to say thank you for indulging my window to share what I see in the world, what we see from the perspective of the Community Foundation. Thank you for being a part of this work. Thank you for taking this message, hopefully, of hope and optimism and progress. And thank you for taking the time and joining us for this annual meeting. Like I said, normally we'd wrap up and wander over to the ice cream bar and have a chance to connect. Knowing that that's the rain check, I really do invite you to send any comments or questions or feedback to my email, dsmith@vermontcf.org. And I'll end where I started, which is just saying thank you again to the team and to the staff that made this possible. It is an incredible privilege to work with you all.